Do I feel that history can impact the development of our communities? I think it already is. I think we're just a culmination of history in that way. Things that influence my life and the community's life and the city's life and its future have been things that have been started, processes that started 50, 100, 200 years ago and are reaching this point. So you're just expanding your frame of reference. And that's how history kind of works. I'm Jeff Jewell. I am the Photo Archives Research Technician at the Whatcom Museum. And I work with our photo collections and making them accessible to the public through exhibitions and resale. So Whatcom was the town on the estuary of Whatcom Creek. And it was the first town. It was the site of the Rotor Peabody Mill. And Whatcom is somewhat cursed if you're looking for shipping with tide flats. So all the sand and debris from the creek over the millennia had created a huge deposit out in front of Whatcom. So to reach deep water, you had to build piers that were about 3/4 of a mile out.
So life on the waterfront before they dredged the Whatcom Waterway and before most of the big industrial mills were built was definitely a lot messier. The shoreline was really uneven and it was a dangerous place in some ways, but it was also a place that was much closer to its natural state. So dredging the Whatcom Waterway really changed the city, and it happened at the same time that some other changes were going on. It led to the introduction of heavy industry to the waterfront, and so it allowed for a port that would have containers at it instead of people just unloading stevedores and people who would unload goods by hand in the old way. So the containerized port could accept much bigger shipments, and that led to much bigger industries. So from about 1890 to 1910, the area on Holly Street, that's now part of the Ledyard Streets neighborhood, sometimes called Old Town, was Whatcom's red light district. And it was a place where there were a lot of businesses that oriented towards the working population and the working men of the waterfront. So it meant that there were a lot of bars, there were a lot of restaurants, single room occupancy, cheap hotels, and then there was a lot of sex being sold down there. This was one of the few economic opportunities available to women at the time in Whatcom, given the ways in which women were denied access to the labor market. So it's an important part of women's history, and it's important to also not romanticize it because a lot of the conditions there were really challenging, and we kind of need to hold some complexity when we look at that to see both the opportunities for independence it afforded, because these businesses were often run by women and again were some of the only really high-paying or medium-paying jobs that they could find in town at the time. And at the same time, it was a place that obviously promoted a logic of sexualizing women and limiting their access to public space. Part of the purpose of the red light district was to confine women's access to public space, really, because outside of that area, there were a lot of restrictions on their movement.
The idea was we would restrict prostitution to that part of town. The thinking being if we could contain it and require them to pay a fine, which is a way of saying a license, then we would have control of it. And that restricted district lasted until 1910. And what happened in 1910 that changed the law? Women gained suffrage. And so the first time they could vote, right? And they voted out the restricted district. Of course, why wouldn't they? But lo and behold, what happened is you're no longer containing it in that district. It spreads all over town. So most importantly, or sadly, it moved uptown, mainly to Railroad Avenue.
What we've seen in Bellingham is a transition from a working waterfront to one that is really more at a human scale and is more focused on leisure, recreation. And that seems to be something that people really enjoy here. But it's also required a lot of work. And so there are a number of ongoing projects under the Model Toxic Control Act, or MTCA, that are trying to clean up different sites on the waterfront that industry polluted and really denied people access to for a long time. Now people want to get out there, and that's great, but there's also a lot of things that need to be remediated before it's safe for people to be down there.
People are passionate about the waterfront, and we have diverse views on what people would like to see developed there, whether it's parks for public access or jobs for economic development, and then everything in between. So fortunately we have a large enough property to redevelop that it can support all those community objectives, and we've had a really amazing community support for the project, which if we didn't have that, it wouldn't happen. The pulp mill closed down in 2001. Over 1,000 people lost good paying jobs, and so it became a real concern for both the Port of Bellingham and the City of Bellingham. And together we formed a Waterfront Futures Group, which was a citizen advisory board to look at what is the future of Bellingham Waterfront. That culminated in the Port acquiring the property in January 2005 and began to work with the different project partners, including City of Bellingham, Department of Ecology, to perform the necessary cleanup to support a mixed-use redevelopment of the downtown waterfront. There's been a tremendous amount of work that's happened since that time as far as environmental cleanup, preparing the site for redevelopment, demolishing many of the Georgia Pacific pulp mill that used to be on the site. Two of the challenges that we face, and we knew this when we acquired the property, is number one, it's a long-term redevelopment project. So we anticipate full build-out. It's going to be 40 to 50 years. It's a huge amount of property. It's about 237 acres, 3 miles of shoreline. And so over the long-term redevelopment of the site, we've had changes in elected officials, both on the Port Commission, the City Council, the Mayor. And so just making sure that people are up to speed on what the objectives of the project are as we transition the different leadership has been one of the challenges, but also an opportunity to showcase what's happened and the importance of it. People say Bellingham has everything except for a connection to the water in kind of the downtown heart, and so we've seen really a revitalization of Bellingham's downtown and a lot of interest in people coming down and being part of the development and connecting because it is so close, and it'll just, something about being next to the water is important to the community. And when the community is interested and comes down, the businesses and the economic opportunities are going to follow.
The water is obviously a really scenic and beautiful part of Bellingham today, and looking across the bay at the Lummi Nation and their peninsula is a big part of the experience of being here, and is something that I think draws a lot of people to this place and has a lot of people stay here. And so though the waterfront was in many ways really important to this city in a functional way as a means to export things and as a means to have industry, now I think there's a much greater appreciation for its natural and scenic beauty.